Happy evening, dear students. Happy to meet you with another e-content. And today I'm going to discuss about research design. Research design is nothing but the arrangement of conditions for the collection and analysis of data so that the researcher can do a research process without any hindrance. In fact, to be very precise, research design is the conceptual structure within which the research is to be conducted. So it is nothing but the blueprint of how a research is to be carried out, how the collection of data is to be done, how do you measure the data, and how the data is analyzed. All that is done with the help of research design. And more explicitly, the design happens to be in respect of what the study is about, and why is the study being conducted, and where will the study be carried out, and what type of data is required, and where can the data be found. All that you have to ask yourself a number of questions for which you have to get a formal solution. And research design can be split into four parts, to be very precise. The first one is the sampling design, which deals with the method of selecting the items to be observed in the given study. The second part of research design is the observational design, which results to the condition under which the observation are to be made. The third is the statistical design, where you have to discuss about how the data is to be observed and how the information and data gathered are analyzed with the help of statistical tools and techniques. And the fourth one is the operational design, which is a technique by which the sampling, the statistical, and the observational designs are carried out. So these are the four parts of research design. And research design mostly consists of the following factors. The first one is the way in which the information is obtained, the availability of the the skills of the researcher and his staff if required, the objective of the problem to be studied, the nature of the problem to be studied, the amount of money and time involved in carrying out the research work. And we are going to discuss about the different concepts related to research design. The first one is the dependent and the independent variable. If one variable depends upon another variable, it is called as the dependent variable. And the variable that is antecedent to the dependent variable is called as independent variable. For example, if you happen to see the growth of a plant, okay, the plant requires water or sunlight. So here the growth of the plant can be considered as the dependent variable, and the amount of sunlight that it receives is the independent variable. So the amount of sunlight affects the growth of a plant. So here the amount of sunlight is the independent variable and the growth of the plant is the dependent variable. So from this we could say that dependent variable is something which depends on the other variable. An independent variable is antecedent to the dependent variable. The next important concept related to research design is extraneous variable. Extraneous variables is something like which is having an indirect influence on the variable. For example, in the previous example, I said the example of the growth of a plant and the amount of sunlight that it receives. For a plant to grow, just sunlight alone is not mere sufficient. It requires soil fertility. It requires water. It requires the fertilizers to be given. All those are variables which have an indirect impact on the growth of the plant, apart from the independent variable. That the variable which is having an influence on the dependent variable is called as extraneous variable. But see, these are variables which they are not independent variables as such, but they could affect the results of the experiment. That is called as extraneous variables. And there are four types of extraneous variable. First one is situational variable, which means these are aspects of the environment that might affect the participants' behavior or the respondents' behavior. For example, the noise which is heard outside, the temperature, the lighting conditions, all these are called as situational variables. And the second one is participant variable. This refers to um, the way in which each participant vary from the other and how this could affect the results. For example, the anxiety level, the concentration level, the intelligence level, all that will not be the same for everyone. So I could give you an example. If a participant is performing a memory test, and if suppose he's so much tired, and or if he has a poor eyesight, which could have a direct impact on the performance of the respondent. So they are called as participant variable or the personal variable. The third one is experimental variable. Experimental variable is he unconsciously convey to the participant how they should behave. He is informing the respondent the way in which they have to behave. So that is called as experimental variable. See, the experiment might do this by giving an unintentional clue to the participant about what the experiment is all about and why it is done and how the participants are expected to behave. So this will affect the participants' behavior, isn't it? So that is called as experimental variable. The last one is demand characteristics. See, demand characteristics is when they are the clues in an experiment which will convey to the participant the purpose of the research. See, like for example, the participants will be affected by their surroundings, by the researcher's characteristics, the researcher's behavior, or we could say the interpretation of what is going on in the situation. So that is called as demand characteristics. So these are the four types of extraneous variable. The next important concept related to research design is control. See, control is it is used when we design the study minimizing the effects of extraneous independent variable. Control is it is used to restrain some experimental conditions. So that is called as control. And the next important concept is confounded relationship. When the dependent variable is not free from the influence of the extraneous variable, then we could say that the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable is confounded. Okay, so that is called as confounded relationship. Next one is, see, for example, I could give you an example for this. Say, for example, for this confounded relationship, say, for example, you test 200 volunteers, of which 100 are men and 100 are women. So you find that lack of exercise leads to weight gain. One problem with your experiment is that it lacks any control variable. For example, the use of placebos or random assignment to groups. So you really can't say for sure whether lack of exercise leads to weight gain or not. One confounding variable is how much people eat. It's also possible that men eat more than women. This could also make sex a confounding variable. Nothing was mentioned about starting with regard to weight, occupation, or age either. So, if all the women in the study were middle aged, for example, and if all the men were age 16, so age would have a direct effect on weight gain. So, this again makes age a confounding variable. So, this is called as confounded relationship. The next one is research hypothesis. Research hypothesis is when you formulate a research hypothesis, there should be at least one dependent variable and one independent variable. So any research hypothesis is put to test. When a prediction or a relationship is tested by scientific methods, and they are called as research hypothesis. The next important concept related to research design is experimental and non-experimental hypothesis testing research. When the purpose of research is to test a research hypothesis, it is called as hypothesis testing research. I could give you an example. Say, for example, uh, when a research in which the independent variable is manipulated, when an independent variable is manipulated, it is called as experimental hypothesis testing research. And a research where the independent variable is not manipulated, it is called as non-experimental hypothesis testing research. Suppose a researcher wants to study whether intelligence affects the reading ability for a group of students. So, for this purpose, the investigator or the researcher randomly selects 50 students and tests their intelligence and the reading ability. So, this is an example of non-experimental hypothesis testing research because here the independent variable, that is intelligence, is not manipulated. For example, but the researcher randomly selects 50 students from a group of students and who are to take a course in statistics, and then divides the 50 into two groups, randomly assigning 25 to group A, the usual studies program, and 25 to group B, the special studies program. So at the end of the course, there he administers a test to each group in order to judge the effectiveness of the training program regarding the students' performance level. So this is an example of an experimental hypothesis testing research because in this case the independent variable is manipulated. Okay, so this is the example for experimental hypothesis testing research. So the next one is experimental or control group. In an experimental hypothesis testing research, when a group is exposed to usual conditions, it is called as experiment control group. But when a group is exposed to special conditions, it is called as experimental group. So in the previous example I gave, right, in group A can be called as control group and the group B is called as an experimental group. If both the groups A and B are exposed to special studies program, then they would be called as experimental groups. So that is the difference between experimental and control groups. Next one is treatment. The different conditions under which the experimental and control groups are put are usually called as treatments. So in the above illustration which I gave you, the two treatments are the usual studies program and the special studies program. Similarly, if I wanted to determine through an experiment the comparative impact of three varieties of fertilizers on the yield of wheat. So in that case, the three varieties of fertilizers will be treated as three treatments. Next one is experiment. The process of examining the truth of a statistical hypothesis relating to some problem related to research is called as experiment. For example, you can conduct an experiment to examine the usefulness of a new developed drug. Again, experiments can be classified into two, the absolute experiment and the comparative experiment. And suppose if you wanted to determine the impact of a fertilizer on the yield of a crop, it is called as absolute experiment. But if you want to determine the impact of one fertilizer as compared to the impact of another fertilizer, then it is called as comparative experiment. The next one is experimental units. The predetermined plots or the blocks where the different treatments are used is called as experimental units. So such units has to be selected very carefully. So thank you so much for your understanding. Hope to catch you with another set of e-content very shortly.